Very special thanks to Cars of Somerset for, of course, providing the vehicle in this review. As I always like to do, I've dropped a link to their website, in particular their current stock page, in the description right below this video. And from there, of course, you can find their contact details and even get them to source you a vehicle if you want to. So, of course, check that out down below. And who knows, you might even grab this car. There are two ongoing theories which I have about the performance car world in particular, which come into play with a vehicle such as this one. One of my theories is regarding the boy racer phenomena, and the second one is about measuring the advancement of performance cars in general. See, in my opinion, you can tell more about the advancement in technology over the past decades by looking at what is considered a hot hatch than any other kind of vehicle. And you can see that in practice simply by looking at other types of car. If you compare supercars now to what supercars were in the 2000s, well, yes, they've gotten quicker, but not necessarily by as much as you might think. There were a lot of really fast cars in that category, even at the turn of the century. Likewise with sports cars, there were already a ton of really fast ones around, even something like super saloons. It wasn't uncommon for a four-door sedan to have 500 horsepower in its top trim, even in the mid-2000s region. So in many ways, those performance cars have advanced, but not necessarily as radically, in my opinion at least, as hot hatches. See, less than 20 years ago, in the earlier 2000s, a hot hatch would have been something with a crazy colour for about £17,000 to £20,000, with somewhere in the region of 200 to 250 horsepower. That was the best you could get. A Golf GTI or an R32 or a Ford Focus ST. Those were the kings of boy racer cars. Nowadays, though, the hot hatch scene is completely different. Sure, you can get some with those kind of numbers, but it's now not uncommon to see all-wheel drive, launch control, automatic gearboxes, even price tags of around £40,000 or more in the case of top-tier, absolute fastest hot hatches, such as Mercedes A45 AMGs. There are even hot hatches now that can break the 4-second barrier for 0 to 60. Thanks to stuff like all-wheel drive, which barely any hot hatches used to use. Now that comes into play here because if you compare this third generation S3, which is technically the 8V type Audi A3 as its base, to its two predecessors, well, it's a drastic improvement again. This weighs another 60 kilos less than the car which came before it. It still has a 2-litre 4-cylinder turbo engine. Unless I'm mistaken, I believe at the time it was actually the most impressive power output that Audi had gotten from a 2-litre 4-pot in the form of 300 horsepower, which is already a lot more, of course, than I mentioned in the earlier 2000s. It has all-wheel drive, and for those who are so inclined, you can even buy it with both an automatic or manual gearbox option. Now the one I'm driving has the auto, of course, with paddles, so you've got all the bases covered. And until not all that long ago, this was the top of the tree, or at least it would have been, because there was no RS3 in the 2000s. That came along a little bit later, and it's kind of one of those things that we take for granted now. The S3 used to be the top of the tree for Audi hot hatches, and now it's almost easy to forget about it because of the RS3. It's kind of a shame because there's an awful lot to like about this car. Now in terms of the spec, I've already touched on some of it. 2-litre turbo, 4-cylinder, all-wheel drive. Of course you can have it with technically 3 or 5 doors. Really it's 2 or 4, not counting the hatch. And in terms of performance, well, it's fantastic. As I said in the thumbnail, sports car levels of performance. Now for those who love their manual gearboxes in hot hatches or just in general, you're not going to like what I have to say next, because many of you know I'm not a fan of manual cars in any form, but this one is one occasion where the facts back me up, because the manual is slower. Again, another drastic way to see the difference in technology from now compared to 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the Auto was always slower. Nowadays, it's always faster because they've just gotten better and better, and this is one such example. This car came out in 2013 in this form and ran until 2016, so relatively short run for this particular model, and in 2016 you were kind of already moving toward the facelifted version again with a little bit more power. In terms of torque, incidentally, it's a really thumpy motor thanks to the turbo aspiration as well, 280 pound-feet, so those numbers are really nice to be working with. And again, even though it's technically not an RS3, these numbers would have destroyed hot hatches in the earlier 2000s. I mean, forget a Ford Focus ST, those front-wheel drive hatches don't stand a chance against one of these. And one of the key reasons why is also the key reason why that Auto is quicker as well, because that version has launch control. Now, the manual can do 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds, or thereabouts, but the Auto can do it in about 5.1 at most. So in other words, this is literally a hot hatch that you can buy for about 12.5 to sometimes even on the higher end £22,000, which is legitimately quicker off the line than my Maserati was. Again, unheard of less than 20 years ago. What about handling though? Because of course, you could even argue more so than most of my other reviews, hot hatches are all about the cornering. Sure, straight line performance is great, but that's not where you have your fun. You have fun on the B roads. These are B road ballers in the literal sense. This one is fantastic through corners. Now, I will say, unsurprisingly for a hot hatch, it's kind of part of the territory. It's a little stiff and harsh on the suspension side, so don't expect extreme comfort. It is, of course, a performance car first, not a comfortable machine, and again, it's not based on like an A6, for instance, such as the RS6 recently was, which is already a comfortable car to begin with. This is an A3, so it's a more budget level, entry level hatchback, albeit one that's taken to a performance extreme. However, much like my thoughts on the Porsche 911, the 997 shape in particular, where I had a similar comment about the harsh suspension, once again here it's 100% justified. I have no problem with the suspension being harsher because that's the point of the car. Just like with the 911, it's a sports car. It's designed to be good through corners, not comfortable through corners. So this one shares that in common. Now, in terms of practicality, it's actually a lot better than it easily could be. Because again, back in those slightly older hatchbacks, you tended to have one of two extremes. There were the ones which were really affordable and really useful, like your Fiat Panda 100 HP, which is one of my personal favourites, or a Golf GTI or even GTD. And then you had the ones which were just nuts, like the Clio V6, which is technically a hatchback, but it's more like a sports car that happens to have a hatchback body. With this one, well, you've got the performance of what would have been extreme back then, but with great practicality as well. I already mentioned, of course, that this is 60 kilos lighter than its predecessor, about 1400 kilos, which again, for all-wheel drive with an automatic is not bad at all. But in terms of stuff like fuel economy, again, hot hatches aren't exactly known for that, but this one's really good for what it is. The official numbers quote it at 31 to the gallon in the city, 49 on the highway, and an average of 40. Now, you're not actually going to get those numbers most of the time, at least according to many owners, because aggregator sites online say you should expect more like 32, 33 to the gallon average. And of course, being a hot hatch, it's intended to be used. So chances are whoever the previous owner was probably drove it pretty fast a lot of the time. And that, interestingly, brings me to my other theory. And this one might even be more controversial than the first one that I said at the start of the video, because there's something called a boy racer. It's a very popular term, it always has been, but my hot take on this subject is actually there's no such thing. See, to me, boy racer is not a class of person or a class of driver. Boy racer is an effect. It's something that the vehicle does to you, not that you do to the vehicle. And what I mean by that is very similar to if you compare, for instance, a learner legal 125cc motorcycle on a track day compared to if somebody gave you a full-on superbike, like a MotoGP level machine. Now, if you're a pro driver, you'll be able to get the best out of both bikes. But if you're not, well, you'll be able to simply use more of the power and more of the performance in the lesser machine. and you may even find it more fun. And that's where my theory comes in. See, I believe that if you take a vehicle such as this, or even all the way down to the perfect example of something like a 205 GTI from Peugeot or a Panda 100 HP from Fiat, they've got such a tiny amount of power to work with that you get to use all of it, and you don't need to worry about the car losing control. You can have maximum fun on the lowest possible numbers. It's something that Japanese K cars do brilliantly as well. Now this one, of course, with 300 horses is in a totally different league to something like a Panda, but the point remains. This is at least as fun through corners as an RS4 or an RS6. And I should know, because I've reviewed both of those on the channel. In fact, they were a similar age to this car. They had way more power, and of course in a straight line they would both utterly demolish this car. But through corners, this is easily every bit as fun. It's smaller, it's lighter, it's got that more thumpy engine, and even though you don't have 500-600 horses, you can use every one of those 300 that you do have. And even though technically it is slower, 5.1 seconds isn't exactly lacking. That's actually fantastic by hot hatch standards. So overall, for something which, as I mentioned earlier on, you can buy for about £12,500 currently, at least toward the start of 2021, for a higher mileage car, sometimes even six figures. On the lower end, if you get a newer one like a 2015 end of run before the facelift with really low miles, like 30,000 or less, you can easily pay up to like 22 grand, so it depends how much you want to pay. The point is though, you can definitely get a bargain. 12.5 to like 15, 16,000 is pretty much prime hot hatch territory, even for a used one. And for those who are curious about what issues you should look out for, and of course, as I always like to mention in my reviews, if you are a current owner of one of these, if you used to have one, of course put your warnings and stories and maybe pros and cons down in the comments, because if somebody is watching this video who's thinking about buying one, they can read those and get even more information. But from what I could find from owners forums, etc., the four primary issues that you need to look out for when checking out one of these is the water pump. They sometimes have an issue. The headlight bulbs have a tendency for breaking or, going out in effect. The pads and discs, for understandable reasons, tend to get, let's say, a healthy amount of use in one of these, so check those. And you will want, in the automatic version in particular, to make sure it's had an oil and filter change for that automatic gearbox. The manual, not so much. Overall though, the general consensus is that it's a pretty reliable car, and it also benefits from being, in comparison, simpler than something like a full-on RS model. Of course, the parts are cheaper, for instance, than something like that, although this is not a cheap car to run, so of course you always need to bear that in mind with any performance vehicle of any age, with basically no exceptions. Overall though, my thoughts on this car are actually fairly simple and straightforward, but I'm pleased to be able to confirm that if you're looking for something which has almost that kind of vibe of what would have been the absolute pinnacle of the 2000s, like a Golf R32 in that sweet spot of like 2005, 2006, it delivers that exact kind of vibe, and many of those specs as well, and in fact it can outdo a lot of those cars. But it has modern advances in being lighter, better fuel economy than its predecessor, and even used prices that offer, in comparison to the 2000s, in effect a lot more car for the money. The interior design, of course, is not going to be up to par compared to many of the other cars that I talk about on the channel, since many of those are full-on exotics, but again, for a hatchback, it's good enough. The space is good, and if you were wondering about the space inside for somebody like me who is a taller, bigger driver, well, I can actually report it's pretty good. I fitted in the car just as well as I would hope, and although the headroom is good enough for sure for me to sit in, the one thing which I would bear in mind is, funnily enough, similar to the Mercedes AMG GTS, and that is that your head technically fits in the car, but your eye line will be very high in comparison to the window. So if you are a taller driver, keep that in mind. You will, however, find it's got more than enough space for most people. Even in the back, in the two-door version, the rear seats are still pretty adequate, as is the boot space. So overall, pretty great little motor, good price for what it is, and fantastic performance. The only thing that I don't like as much about this car is, in my opinion, it doesn't really look flash enough. I wanted it to look more extreme, and its predecessors kind of did. That first generation 1.8 with the bright yellow colour, then the second generation with the more overt body, it looks more like a proper hot hatch. This one to me is a little bit too much of a sleeper, but in the case of this car with the optional chin splitter, that kind of stuff, you could always do a few updates if you wanted to. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts. Of course, stick around on the channel for more car reviews. Click the annotation in the top right of the video to check out the other reviews which I referenced in this video, such as the RS4 and the RS6, and of course, stick around on the channel for more Beards and Cars reviews. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.